I watch her, bent over. She can't even get up out of the hospital chair. With the help of her physical therapist, she manages to make it to a semi-vertical position, but her stick legs are still leaning on the chair, grasping without means for balance. The therapist tries to get her legs to part with their crutch so she can be stable on her own 2 feet and standing, even if not erect. As I mentioned, she is bent over. Pull your hips forward and your shoulders back, the therapist says. That helps a little. She looks less like a candy cane and more like a leaf shooting out of one of the many potted plants in my house. But as soon as she walks, it's back to bent over. She makes it half the length of the hospital room before turning around. Don't fall back into the chair, the therapist chides. You must use your hands and arms to lower you. That will keep you strong. Flopping down won't build your strength at all. Plus, you could miss the chair. I see the fury flash over her recently dull eyes. Just let me sit, it screams before it's gone again. Too much energy is required to maintain frustration for any sensible length of time. So by the time the therapist has showed her how to sit down properly, she's in respite, in the chair again. It never occurred to me that we might need to learn how to sit again. Walking, yes. One sees that all the time in news reports and awe-inspiring reels. Olympic skiers with debilitating injuries take their first step. Children with braces learn mobility. Old people break a hip or a leg and have to learn to walk again. But relearn how to sit, that never occurred to me. My watch dings once and buzzes against my skin. I flip my watch to read it. Time to stand up, it tells me. Clearly, I've been sitting too long, but I'm very good at sitting. She looks like her mother hunched over in that chair. I remember she was 99 too, when she passed. When they moved her to a nursing home and her hair was thin and messy and her back completely curved. She looks like her mother. I look over at my mother. Is she scared? My child looks up at me. Am I scared? I am not scared. There will be no healing from this, no miracle. My grandmother is 99 years old. 3 weeks ago, she was fine, but there have been 3 falls since then and a heart flutter they thought would kill her. She's multicolored like Joseph's coat, but it's hues of brown and dark red and deep purple and black from all the bruising and blood. Her skin is thin, tissue paper tucked around a shirt or a pair of pants. Any mishandling and it's ripped, the gift exposed. She is a gift. But the discs out of place in her back send sharp pain shooting down her legs. That's what's done her in. That's why she's bent over. I wonder why I've been assigned this text to preach today. It seems unkind, since I'm the caretaker for my own bent over woman, my own flesh and blood. To add insult to injury, it's a miracle text, and those are impossible to preach, let alone believe. I assume that's why the bent over woman catching her breath in the chair in front of me checked fair on the survey for physical status, but checked poor next to mental health status. That may be the worst part for her. There will be no more operations, no more miracles. And that makes her sad. She hates being sad. I suffer from depression and am sad all the time. It annoys her that I can't ask God to be happy and then become happy. She's told me as much. So her spirit must grieve heavily that the past 3 weeks have been one nightmare after another for her body. I just want to die, she told my mother from the bathroom floor while they waited for EMS to arrive after her last fall. I know, my mother replied. I know. I've told my mother as much myself over the past few years. This came as quite a shock to her. Mental unhealth is hard for normal people to identify, especially if it involves someone in your own family. We slip people into boxes because they're easier to manage, and when an eye roll at a family member is warranted, we accompany it with a pat on the lid we just pressed down onto their box. I do it all the time. Why shouldn't they have done it to me? My back is not bent, but I have a spirit who cripples me. My therapist, psychological, not physical, would be furious to hear me say this. Framing your spirit as crippling is shame-based. You're not demon-possessed. Some of the brightest and most influential people are neuroatypical. They're the best kind of people, says the psychoanalyst. Grandma and me. We're a real pair. Wait a minute. Demon-possessed? How did I miss that little nugget of joy every time I've read this text? This isn't a healing in a modern medicine, orthopedic spine surgery sort of way. There is a spirit holding this woman down? So this is like an exorcism? I admit I was a little jealous that Tom Russell got assigned the Gerasene Demoniac text for next week. That is such a killer text, but now I've got my own little tiny exorcism to unpack. So this is fun. A spirit. Great. No, I love this. It's fine. Everything's fine. I love the paranormal. It's why I'm a ghost hunter. No, I'm not. I'm not a ghost hunter, but honest to God, I have a second cousin once or twice removed who is an actual ghost hunter. She stopped by to visit my grandma several years ago in between ghost sightings. Like I said, my grandma doesn't like sadness, but sanity, that's not required. Okay, that might be a bit cruel and unnecessary considering I just self-identified as being neurodivergent via an imaginary conversation with my therapist. But like I said, family, boxes, eye rolls, lids, it happens to the best of us. What does it mean that she had a spirit that crippled her? Was the spirit sitting on her back like a little gremlin, holding her down? A paperweight of sorts, swinging his legs back and forth with glee? Is the spirit draped across her in its own sad agony? Is the weight of that tormented being holding her down? Did Jesus free the spirit and in doing so free the woman? I'm tempted not to research or cross-reference this ancient text at all. I kind of want my imagination to do all the work. However, you know as well as I do that my imagination longs to be free and active almost as much as my grandma doesn't want to actively use her arms to lower herself into her chair. I don't want to research this heavyweight demon, but rather finish out the sermon with a song and a dance about gremlins. Headline: Pastor returns to find part-time associate subjugated congregation to hours of workshopping a new musical during worship. Parishioners freed by the associates, mortified parents who led members out a side door, while associates' husband and child tackled and sat on top of her to stop the dancing, though not the singing. Her husband and child sat on top of her. The color of her skin caused her to always watch her back. She bowed her head to keep her mouth shut during mansplaining. She lowered her eyes so as not to give the wrong impression. She shrugged her shoulders every time in apology. She didn't make as much money as the underqualified men around her, but she couldn't risk losing the job by complaining. If she shined too bright, they pulled her down like wallpaper. One tiny notch and a whole piece would rip off. They wouldn't believe her stories of abuse, and they wouldn't let her get an abortion. It's 108 degrees, and she's watched the world burn up around her, but her town doesn't even have a recycling center, let alone sustainable living options. She's queer, but closeted for fear of losing her job or, worse, her family. Her windows have been shattered twice this summer, but she shouldn't complain. What about the homeless or hungry or strung out people throwing the rocks? She's struggling to live up to the standards her ancestors gifted her because colonial systems infiltrate indigenous systems daily. She demonstrated to her first graders the proper live shooter under your desk positioning in the drill today and accidentally threw out her back. She won the vote to office and is thrilled for the opportunity to make a difference, but doesn't have the support to push anything worthwhile through. I guess you could say the weight of the world was on her shoulders. I will not speculate if the spirit on the woman in our text today was a demon or a metaphor. Luke talks about demons nonstop, and my worldview is not so narrow that I will shame ghost hunters or demonstrate ingratitude that I miraculously live in a ghost-free, or at least ghost-friendly, 174-year-old home. And honestly, the metaphor of the world holding you down is not lost on women in Uganda, India, Saudi Arabia, China, Iraq, or Louisiana. Why will I not dwell on the spirit? Because neither Western medicine miracles or Eastern religious exorcisms matter when it was simply the touch of Jesus's hands that healed the woman. Oh, and the simple act of calling her forward. And the simple act of exposing the Pharisaic hypocrisy about the breath of life that is the Sabbath. And the simple act of stirring freedom, joy, and life into the crowd around her, who began shouting from a place of gratitude and liberation. This Sabbath rejoicing at the healing of a marginalized, crippled woman rests in the middle of a chapter focused on judgmentalism. There is so much judgment and shame in the 13th chapter of Luke. Look at it with me. Verses 1 through 5 are about trying to figure out who is the worst sinner, and I guess who is only the mediocre sinner. Verses 6 through 9 are about giving up on people, allegorized as a fig tree, who don't produce fruit, and God saying to the community, oh, how about one more year, one more chance? Today's text verses 10 through 17 are about judging Jesus for healing on the Sabbath instead of waiting for the lawful time of work, which would start the next day at sunup. Verses 18 through 20 talk about the kingdom of God being a slow process that starts small inside a person, inside a community, and grows over time to produce wonderful things. And there's a real come to Jesus moment, pardon the pun, in verses 22 through 30 when people ask, only a few of us are getting into the good place in the afterlife, right? And Jesus gets real with them. let me tell you about who you think is getting in. And the final story in this chapter is about Jesus wanting to mother Jerusalem and God's people, but lamenting that they are so embedded in their ego that they actually kill the people meant to set their spirits and their bodies and their communities free. In other words, Luke 13 is for the middle school mean girls. Enough with the snide obsession about who's cool this week and whose life gets made miserable. Just practice kindness. This chapter is for the bishops and popes and pastors and deacons who vote and give edicts defining boundaries for who's in and who's out. Just let them in. Also, side note to congregations and worship planners, special religious practices shouldn't become hindrances to inclusion. Enough with the sacred cows already. This chapter is for those who have been rejected by the church time and time again for being gay or trans or female or a vulnerable child or a divorcee, or for being Black in a church that's predominantly white, for being liberal in a moderate church, for being conservative in a progressive church, for those who were shunned for being sexually active before marriage, or who couldn't tell anyone they'd had an abortion, or hid the physical abuse experienced at home or in the church. It's for those who have to hide that they find healing and inspirations in religions and worldviews outside of Christianity. It's for those who have chosen relief via pills and needles because the economic system they live in provided no respite and certainly no way out. It's for those who have been to prison or have 2 DWIs, or people who were pulled over for just being Black. It's for those relegated to hospitals and nursing homes, leaning back, unsteady, and bent over, trying to find a crutch, but being told they have to stay strong, as if living 99 years weren't enough of a testimony to life. This chapter is for those who feel sick, marginalized, and forgotten. God sees you. One could read this chapter from the perspective of a youth minister wagging his finger at all of us teens. Oh, the guilt. But if you read it from the other side, it's about an unlawful liberator. It's about a gardener who gives second and third chances to what he's cultivating. It's about a mother hen fussing over the livelihood of her brood. It's about a bent-over woman who finds her balance at the feet of Jesus and stands up. It's about people rejoicing over freedom, true freedom, not pitchforks and pistols freedom, but life-giving, practical, honest, and grateful freedom. I watch my mother watching the bent-over woman, and I am amazed at the matriarchal legacy I've been handed. My grandma survived the Depression and 6 wars. She married the love of her life, and she still mourns his departure from this world. Her appendix burst in her body, and no one caught it until she was very ill. She lost her sister at a young age to brain cancer. She took a couple of college classes to teach at a library, learned technology before anyone else in my family, and she's been a staunch Democrat and Christian, which has informed her vote, her pocketbook, and her generous lifestyle for over 90 years. She doesn't have to stand up now. She's thrown off those hardships time and time again with a smile on her face and a tart in her apron. And I give thanks. Next, I watch my mother, who at an early age learned that the spirit of kindness and generosity will always open the door for people who end up on her front porch. And for this reason, a lot of people have. My mother is like every other person in this chapter who may struggle with feeling judgmental, but my mother's kill 'em with kindness mantra has probably unnerved more than one hater, more than one skeptic, more than one fundamentalist. And if it wasn't her kindness, it was her cherry pie. My child looks at me, and I'm disappointed to report that I probably oscillate between the "you're not letting him in, are you, Jesus?" character, and Jesus himself telling the people in power to pack their bags. My sister says I can hold a grudge better than Oscar the Grouch. And my mom says I'm very bold in the things I say, and I can tell sometimes it makes her proud and sometimes it makes her cry. I rarely associate with the crowd rejoicing in liberation at this story. Rather, I'm the nervous one looking side to side, wondering if this joy is too good to be true. And while I run a tight ship with my child with regard to behavior and language and inclusivity, I don't think I get too wrapped up like the Pharisees and crap like, follow this law about cleanliness. Again, you and your cleanliness can go fly a kite. I'm doing all right. As for the bent-over woman, I don't know much about her. What was her faith, education, ethics, social status? All I know is she was bent over with burden, and sometimes, my darling, that is me too. But my child, the bent-over woman who stoops before you on the medical bed, searching the room with her degenerate eyes for the familiarity of your face, wants you to know that generosity and understanding is key to living in community, even on the Sabbath, maybe even especially on Sunday. Sitting beside the bent-over woman is your grandmother, my mother. She is calm for once and praying for pain regulation. She is my mother, and she wants you to know that welcoming people who are different from you will always be our calling, and that we must be the miracle when liberation is in order. My child, your own mother wants you to know that generosity, liberation, and the inclusive way of Christ is always a call to rejoice. Live into the joy that bent-over people in your family always rise up. Live into the shouts that allyship will bring to your lips. And live into the humility that the door to God's love is always wider than we can ever imagine. And if you could live a life free from judging other people, that would be a miracle. But if anyone can do it, it's you in your generation. Rise up, my child. Christ is calling you to rise up and rejoice in one another's liberation. Amen.